Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'll be discussing my thoughts on the headline questions at PMQs today. Again, as usual, where both the Labour and the SNP used the dire state of the economy to tackle a Prime Minister who seemed to defend himself by talking about another country entirely. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I have to say, just first of all, I was a little bit disappointed when I read the running order. So I read the list of MPs who would be asking questions at PMQs, and I did not see Nadine Dorries there. I thought it would have been hilarious if she could have stood up and said, "Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell me what happened to my peerage?" But she didn't. Anyway, on to the actual questions, not the ones that are part of my fevered imaginations. Before Starmer stood up, there were two questions from backbenchers. There's always a question from a backbencher who asks the engagement question, then one of their own. On this occasion, there were two, not completely unheard of, but quite unusual. One Labour, one Conservative. And I'm going to mention their questions. I don't usually, but they're quite telling. So the Labour backbencher, first of all, brought up food inflation. Now, Rishi Sunak is trying to make great play of the fact I need to reduce inflation. I said I would halve inflation. I need to reduce. Oh, it's really hard, you know. I need to reduce inflation. But there's inflation and there's inflation, isn't there? And the CPI inflation, apart from anything else, doesn't actually include like the mortgage repayments that are going to suddenly go up. But this Labour backbench wasn't asking about that, but she was pointing out that food inflation doesn't seem to be coming down. And she was asking if Sunak thought people wouldn't notice. Now, obviously, Sunak talked about all the work he was doing in bringing inflation down, which obviously doesn't seem to be doing anything. Because the thing about inflation, I keep saying this, thing about inflation, Rishi Sunak saying, oh, people want me to bring inflation down. It's like, well, yes and no. What they really want is to have an easier time affording the cost of living. So if they see a headline figure that inflation is lower, but they can see that it's harder to pay for things, that's not really doing what they want. And despite his efforts to claim he has a plan and to suggest that it's a problem everywhere else, if people cannot afford what was considered a basic standard of living a few years ago, and food's a big part of that, he's not really going to convince people that giving his party another 5 years in power is a good idea. Then the second question. Now, this was from a Tory backbencher who'd obviously had his question planted, but that's quite common, that happens. And he made the point that Labour have never left office with unemployment lower than when it started. Now, I'm sure, of course, this has got nothing to do with the fact that Labour governments record these stats and Conservative governments fiddle them by moving the goalposts, you know, like 0 hours contracts and things like that. All a coincidence, I'm sure. But the most important point is this. If people have jobs, they're classed as employed, but they cannot afford the cost of living, is employment really an issue for voters in that regard? Is the actual employment rate really an issue? Or in this case, they're talking about low unemployment rate rather than high employment rate. It's not always the same thing. Like David Cameron would keep saying, you know, the one who inflicted austerity, he would keep saying, we must make work pay. We must make work pay. Don't pay, does it? Doesn't pay. If people have to choose between eating and heating in the winter, is work paying? Is it even that much better in summer? After all, the heating may be off, but people are still paying for it because their direct debits have managed to spread the cost out over the year. You know, if Sunak has any serious hopes of winning the general election, and that's a huge if, I really don't know what he's thinking. These are issues he has to tackle. He can't just pretend to be living in this country where everything's going brilliantly. He has to recognise the country he has and improve it. But anyway, on to Starmer's questions. And he wove a theme around a country suffering a cost of living crisis, but led by a government that's arguing about who should get a peerage. You know, I won't go through the questions one by one because they essentially hammered the same basic points. First, that the Tories are more interested in squabbling for benefits for themselves than serving the country. Second, the country is not going to recover until a serious government is in charge. And as part of the questioning, Starmer not only hammered the fact that Sunak had permitted the honouring of people whose service was to cover up for Johnson's law-breaking, that people who parted on the eve of the late Queen's service for her husband will now be honoured by the King. And politics aside, that's quite grim. I actually thought, I wondered if Starmer might have even made more of an issue of that, Because think about this. King Charles is going to have to bestow honours on people that he knows were partying on the eve of his father's funeral. But Starmer didn't just have Johnson's honours in sight, but Liz Truss's too, because we've forgotten about that one, haven't we? That's coming. You know, Sunak can try and defend his own role by saying, well, you know, prime ministers are allowed a resignation honours list, and it's not for the following prime minister to interfere. And he made the point, you know, I don't interfere with like Labour nomination, things like that. And you can, a lot of the public will have some sympathy for that position. I can absolutely believe that. But Liz Truss is aiming to honour people who advised her to crash the economy, who are responsible for the fact that their mortgages are now hundreds of pounds more expensive per month than used to be the case. And by what right does she have an honours list at all? The leadership contest which made her Prime Minister lasted longer than her time in Downing Street. You know, and despite Sunak's defence, with Starmer bringing it all back to a lack of focus on the country's real problems, the Prime Minister had no real response. Like, Tory MPs know this is a bad look. There were a couple of times when they really did cheer at a couple of pre-prepared lines from Sunak, but most of the time you would hardly know they were there. At one time, Sunak even tried to bring up the Chaos with Ed Miliband line. Oh, that's brave of him. I thought to myself, does he not realise that we use that line now to ridicule the Tories? That line is now deeply embarrassing for the Conservative Party, because do you know what? Quite a lot of the public, if they were to be asked now, were you happy with your purchase, or would you have rather have taken a punt on Ed Miliband? They're going to go for Ed Miliband every time. Does he not realise what he said? You know, it was all quite surreal. Sunak was trying to suggest that a Labour government would be chaotic, and you're like looking around going, have you seen the state of your government? Because the public are seeing the state of your government. He also tried to say that Labour's plans are like ridiculous. They're economic plans, absolutely ridiculous, beyond contempt. And it's like, hang on, have you seen the economic fruits of your Labours? Because people are noticing that. You know, we also know that business leaders are looking forward to many of Labour's economic plans. I've not heard business groups really saying good things about the Tories recently. Have you? I just didn't know what Sunak was attempting here. If it was to try and convince any swing voters who may have been watching, you know, that he is preferable to a Labour government, what evidence did he come up with? If it was to try and fire up his MPs, that didn't seem to be working. Usually, when the government is under serious fire, the MPs in the crucible of PMQs, the MPs of the government, make as much noise as possible. You know, like a sports team firing themselves up after being down at half-time. Now, aside from a few little attempts, it was all just weak. You know, even Sunak got a bit of a telling off from the Speaker for attacking other members of the House, in this case I think it was former members of the House, and making up his own questions. Starmer ended up by calling on Sunak to put his money where his mouth was and call a general election. Now, I am wondering if that's going to be a bit of a call. I know Labour later on in their sort of social media campaign bit were like, so we want a general election. Now, they've even put a petition out. Oh, do you want a general election? Let's have a general election. And I am just thinking if that's going to be maybe one of his like rallying calls, the thing he's going to keep saying now when he gets to talk to the public, either directly or indirectly. You know, it's I don't know whether he's calling for the election in order to try and browbeat the Tories into holding one early, or is it reverse psychology? Is Starmer thinking to themselves, actually, it would be much better if the Conservatives hung on a bit longer, took the fall for all the damage they're going to cause, you know, because maybe Labour don't really relish the idea of winning an election this autumn, only for the recession to hit next year, regardless whatever they can do. They can't do anything straight away. The recession hit anyway, and then it's technically hit while they've been in power. Even though people will sort of understand that it was caused by the Conservatives, it's like it'll still be technically, if you look over the timeline of recessions in this country, it will technically have happened in that period of Labour government. So maybe he's thinking, no, the recession starts when you're in power. So I'm going to call for a general election. So just out of spite, you won't call one. As I discussed this morning, the Tories, they might not be well advised to wait for next year before holding an election because, maybe it could be even worse for them. But, Starmer may well prefer that because he can then utterly destroy them. Not forever, of course. But then it was on to Stephen Flynn of the SNP. He opened up with a cheeky little reference to a quote from Sunak last summer when, during the leadership contest, he described the impact on interest rates if Truss won and how it would make it impossible for the Tories to win the election afterwards. So Flynn asked Sunak, given where the mortgage rates are at the moment, if he still held to that political analysis. In other words, does Rishi Sunak believe that the Tories have now got no chance at all? Sunak, I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear, did not answer the question, just noting that with everything happening, the SNP held a meeting in order to agree to send Nicola Sturgeon flowers. And then Stephen Flynn, it's unintentionally funny, I think, he stood up and he told Rishi Sunak to grow up. And it was just like Jack D. It was so funny. It was just the deadpan way he delivered it. It was just like watching Jack D. But anyway, Flynn then went on to sort of describe the premium that Brexit is applying to the cost of living and said Sunak really should be apologising for this. Naturally, Sunak didn't really feel he had anything to apologise for. His government's getting on with the delivering for the people. Oh, the jobs, so many jobs, and everyone's delighted with the standard of living in Rishi land. No complaints at all. Not entirely sure where this place is that Sunak's delighted with. As a little aside, I was reading a report in The Guardian about a very Tory area in the upcoming by-election in Selby and Ainsty. The two by-elections that are now happening have now been pushed, so they are going to happen next month. So Selby and Ainsty, this report was written based on canvassing in a very Tory part of it. The Selby part of it's Labour, that's fine. The rest of it is very Tory, and their canvassing was suggesting a lot of people telling them they're not going to vote Tory. And yet, interestingly, they didn't want the Guardian to publish their names or show photos of them in case their neighbours found out. So it's almost like this spiral of silence that happened in 1992, where there was a lot of people saying, oh no, I'm not going to vote Conservative, and then did. And it was almost like they didn't want to tell someone who was polling them that they would do it, but then they did anyway, just because. And you're just thinking, is this going to be a similar situation? Like, no one wants to admit that they're going to vote, that they're going to vote against the Tories because they live in Tory town. They're surrounded by Tories. Their neighbours are Tories. But maybe each of them individually is thinking to themselves, I'm not voting Tory. And this could actually, it looks like Selby and Ainsty looks like a toss-up between Labour and the Conservatives. It could actually not even be that close. Labour could take it. And it might not even be that close. I also see reports that the Conservatives have selected their candidate yet. Labour, I think, are selecting theirs tomorrow or Friday. The Conservatives already selected theirs, I gather. It's a pro-fracking candidate. Oh, dear me. I mean, for a contest that on paper is going to be quite tight, you really need a good candidate. I've said it before, I've said it again. It's not just that the Tories are in a mess. Having presided over 13 years of economic mismanagement and delivering the two worst prime ministers in history, but even a competent, sensible, sane, pragmatic Conservative government right now would be really up against it. But that's not what we've got. We've got a government that simply don't know what they're doing. For a tricky by-election, you want a strong candidate. The Tories have gone for someone who is vocally supportive of an unpopular policy, and it's unpopular with Conservative voters as well. This seems a suboptimal strategy to me. And I will just note, finally, going back to Starmer. So he wasn't just making decent political points in his questions about the Tories, presiding over a great deal of damage in the country, but focused on their own internal squabbles. He was absolutely right, because later on, one of the most remarkable questions, a Tory backbencher stood up. Now, they were talking about buy one, get one free. So it's the usual crap. Oh, we should have buy one, get one free. But before he gave his actual question, he basically slated Boris Johnson. He got up and attacked Boris Johnson. And he sort of say, oh, he didn't obviously call him by name, the former Prime Minister, I think he referred to him as, the former member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip is how you refer to them. And he was saying, he said the government's not conservative enough. Well, isn't it a shame that he wasn't Prime Minister with an 80-seat majority, or he could have done something about it? Obviously, lots of laughing on the Tory and the Labour benches. Labour MPs couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it. They were shouting more, because, you know, they just couldn't believe the infight. Starmer was pointing out the fact that the Tories were like focused on their own internal squabbling. That's the point he needs to try and make, to get the country to think, hang on, these are no good in government. They're just squabbling children. And yet here, the Tories utterly clueless. They engage in this pastime of indulging in their own affairs and ignoring the public. I couldn't believe it. And I thought to myself, why did he say that? Did Rishi Sunak? Because Rishi Sunak laughed at it. It's like he approved of it. If I'd have been the party leader, I'd have been aghast at that. I'm wondering if Sunak even advised him to put that in as part of his question. You know, we get that Tory MPs want Johnson gone now, but to show your division so openly here seems madness. And for Sunak to laugh at the statement, as I say, perhaps even have fed the question to the backbencher, maybe, just speaks to me of a party leader who hasn't got a clue. If I was to see the equivalent happening on the Labour benches as a Labour supporter, I would be horrified, absolutely horrified. You know, regardless of my feelings for the individual personalities involved, just the idea of Labour MPs attacking Labour MPs would be horrific. Madness, out of touch. They're going to lose. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.